Okay, let's unpack this. So picture this. You're sitting in a room, it's pretty dimly lit, maybe hands joined around a table, waiting. And then suddenly there's a rap, then another one, the table actually starts to move. And then, maybe a moment later, a little slate slides out from under the table, and it's got a message written on it, supposedly from someone who's passed on, written seemingly out of nowhere. I mean, baffling, right? How could that even happen?
Absolutely baffling. And these were exactly the kinds of claims that, well, they absolutely captivated and mystified people back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was the era of modern spiritualism. And we've got a really fascinating stack of material here today, all centered around investigations into these alleged spiritualist and occult phenomena.
Yeah, and our main guide through all this, based on these sources, is Henry Ridgley Evans. He was an author, an investigator from that time, and his work really forms the basis for a deep dive.
Exactly. And what's really clear from these sources is that Evans wasn't, a believer promoting mediumship. He wasn't offering teachings towards it like he endorsed it.
No, not at all. The opposite, really. He comes across as this sharp, critical observer, someone really dedicated to exposing fraud and finding natural, rational explanations for stuff that other people were putting down to the supernatural.
Precisely. So our mission here is educational, right? We're kind of stepping back in time, immersing ourselves in Evans's world, his investigations. We're going to explore this whole landscape of alleged spiritualist manifestations just as is presented in these sources. We'll dive deep into the analysis, the conclusions that critical observers like Evans were drawing about mediumship, about occult claims. What did they actually find when they looked closely? What explanations did they come up with for these seemingly impossible things?
And why should you care about this today? Well, because understanding how people back then were so easily captivated, sometimes outright deceived, by these extraordinary claims, and how critical thinking, how investigation help peel back those layers of illusion. That's incredibly relevant now.
Oh, absolutely. We live in an age just swimming in information, claims, sometimes, frankly, misinformation.
Right. So learning how to sift through it, apply some skepticism, look for the evidence, consider other explanations. That's a timeless skill, isn't it? And this deep dive into Evans's work, it's like a historical masterclass in that whole critical approach.
Definitely. Now, to really get a handle on this era, the sources point to this fundamental philosophical backdrop. There was this sort of great divide in how people saw the world, the nature of reality itself.
Yeah, it's presented as this real tension between two big worldviews. On one side, you had the materialists, and their core idea, as it's described here, was pretty stark. Matter is all in all.
Right. Matter is the fundamental thing. Everything else, mind, consciousness, you name it, is just a result of matter interacting in complex ways.
Yeah.
Everything boils down to physical force, motion, mechanics.
From the perspective we're getting in these sources, though, that view seemed kind of bleak. It's described as a barren, dreary, comfortless belief, even though it was pretty dominant in that age of scientific materialism.
Well, science was making huge leaps explaining the physical world. And for a lot of people, that led to the conclusion that only the physical world was real, or at least the only thing worth studying seriously.
But that left a gap, didn't it? For people looking for meaning or purpose or evidence of something, more than just atoms bumping around. Which brings us to the other side of that divide.
The spiritualistic view. This was the counter-argument. It basically said, no, spirit or mind is the ultimate substance god, and matter, the physical world, is just its visible expression.
Sort of the outward sign of an inner reality.
Exactly. And this perspective may be fueled by how cold materialism felt to some. It sparked what the sources call a great reaction.
And that reaction showed up in different ways.
Yeah. For some, it meant a return to or a strengthening of traditional religious faith, increased vitality of dogmatic religion, as it's put. But for others, it led to these brand new movements like modern spiritualism and theosophy. And these movements weren't just philosophizing, they were actively trying to demonstrate the reality of spirit.
And spiritualism, specifically, made this incredibly bold claim, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely bold. It didn't just argue that the soul is immortal. It declared it was a demonstrable fact. It claimed it could provide actual observable proof of life after death through seances, through phenomena people could witness. It essentially threw down the gauntlet of defiance to skepticism.
Challenging the materialists on their own turf, the world of observation.
Precisely. And that challenge is exactly what drew in investigators like Henry Ridgley Evans. He wanted to pick up that gauntlet spiritualism had thrown down and see if the claims could actually hold up under close critical examination.
So to even start investigating, they needed some way to organize all these different claims, right? This huge variety of alleged events.
Exactly. The sources explain that investigators typically divided the phenomena of modern spiritualism into two main classes. Understanding the split is really key to how they approach the whole subject.
Okay, so what's the first class?
The first is physical phenomena. These are the manifestations that, if they were real, would need some kind of unknown force acting directly on the physical world. Something happening without using the medium's own body, their muscles, their brain in any obvious way. These were the events that seemed to just flat out defy known physics.
Like you said, tables moving, objects floating, that kind of thing.
Precisely that. The
Yeah.
sources list a whole bunch of examples. Those mysterious rappings or knockings coming from nowhere, furniture sliding across the room, bells ringing, musical instruments playing without anyone touching them, strange lights popping up in the dark.
The really dramatic stuff, like materializations.
Yeah, materializations, hands, faces, sometimes even full forms appearing, looking solid, coming out of thin air, or maybe from inside a cabinet. That definitely falls under physical phenomena.
What about the slate writing example I started with? Direct writing.
Yep, that's in there too. Direct writing or drawing, where messages or pictures appear on slates or paper without any visible hand. Also, alleged spirit photography. Ghostly figures showing up in photos. Levitation, either of the medium or objects. Mediums getting miraculously untied from ropes or bandages. Supposed elongation of the medium's body. Even claims of handling fire without getting burned.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
quite a list. It's all stuff that suggests some external non-physical force messing with the physical world.
Exactly, that was the implication. So what's the second class then?
The second class is subjective phenomena. Now, these manifestations are different. They often involve the medium's state of mind, their consciousness, their mental or emotional state, or they seem to involve getting information that isn't known through the normal senses.
Ah, okay. So less about physical objects moving around, more about communication, perception, maybe mental states. That's a good way to put it. Examples here include table tilting or turning, but specifically when there is contact, when the sitters or the medium have their hands on the table. The claim was still that spirit power was moving it, but there was physical contact involved.
Okay, so the physical link makes it subjective.
In this classification, yes. It also includes writing or drawing that happens through the medium's own hand, often when they're in a trance. Full entrancement itself, where the medium seems to lose their own personality. Trance speaking or impersonation, where the medium talks in different voices or acts like they're embodying a different person, supposedly a spirit.
Seeing spirits or hearing voices would fit here too, I guess.
Definitely. Seeing spirits or visions that others don't see, hearing phantom voices. These are all subjective phenomena. They're often harder to test physically, right? Because they relate more to someone's internal experience or potentially the hidden capacities of the mind.
Okay, that makes sense. So you've got the big, flashy, physics-defying physical events, and then the more subtle, maybe psychological, subjective experiences. Now, the sources suggest that investigators like Evans really focused a lot of energy on those physical phenomena. Why do you think that was?
Well, I suspect it's because those physical claims were the most direct challenge to that materialistic worldview we talked about. They were presented as objective events happening in the physical world. That made them seem, at least in theory, more testable, more open to scientific methods, to direct observation.
Right. If you could prove a table really moved without touch, or a message appeared without a human hand, that's powerful evidence for the spiritualist side.
Exactly. But conversely, if you could show those same effects were just tricks, just illusions achieved by normal means, well, then you seriously undermine spiritualism's big claim of having demonstrable proof of spirits.
Okay. So when they did investigate these physical phenomena, the sources say there were basically three ways they could be explained from a scientific or rational viewpoint without needing spirits.
That's right. 3 potential non-spirit explanations. The first one they considered was hallucination. The idea that the observers were simply, seeing, hearing, or feeling things that weren't really there objectively.
Was that seen as a likely explanation?
Not usually for group settings. The sources acknowledge hallucinations happen, sure, especially for individuals in certain states. But they point out it's considered a rare phenomenon for several people who aren't hypnotized to all share the exact same complex hallucination at the same time. So maybe it explains a one-off event seen by one person, but probably not a whole séance room witnessing the same thing.
Okay, so hallucination wasn't the main theory. What's the second explanation?
Conjuring or trickery. This is the big one in these sources. It's presented as the most common, the most favored explanation for physical phenomena. Evans' perspective, as it comes through here, was that conjuring explained the vast majority, like 7/8 of the so-called phenomena of professional mediums.
7/8. That's huge.
It is. And this is where Evans and other critical investigators spent a ton of time figuring out the methods, uncovering the deceptions, essentially arguing that most spirit activity was just skilled performance art, basically.
Okay, if trickery explained 7/8, what about the other 1/8? What was the third possibility?
That brings us to a force latent in the human personality. This idea is also called psychic force, or sometimes telekinesis in the sources. It proposed that maybe, just maybe, some rare individuals had an unknown ability, not spirits, not tricks, to influence the physical world directly, to move objects, make sounds, without physical contact.
Like a genuine psychic power, but coming from the person, not a spirit.
Sort of, yeah. But was it presented as, like, accepted science?
No, definitely not widely accepted. It's discussed with some serious caveats. It was a possibility considered by some investigators. Names like Crooks, Gasper, and Lodge come up later, who thought it might explain certain effects that just didn't seem like tricks or hallucinations. But the sources are really clear. Orthodox science viewed this whole idea very suspiciously.
And why were they so suspicious?
The main reason was the lack of reproducibility, consistency. Unlike regular physics, this supposed psychic force was described as very uncertain, prone to fluctuations. You couldn't just get it to happen reliably in a lab under controlled conditions, and that's fundamental for scientific validation.
Right.
If you can't repeat it, you can't really study it scientifically.
Exactly. So while it's floated as a potential explanation for a small slice of the pie, it's definitely presented as something debated, not confirmed at the time.
Got it. So for the vast majority of these physical wonders, the 7/8, the answer, according to Evans and these sources, wasn't spirits or mysterious forces. It was human ingenuity, deception. And the sources go into incredible detail about how these illusions were pulled off. This is where Evans's work really illuminates the methods.
Oh, absolutely. These sources are almost like a magician's exposure manual for the spiritualist trade. Let's dive into that slate writing example again. Mediums like Slade, Keeler. How did they make messages appear on slates, seemingly out of thin air?
Yeah, how did they do it? It sounds completely impossible.
Well, the impossibility was the illusion. The sources lay out several really clever techniques. For just short messages, maybe a name or a word, the medium might have a tiny bit of pencil lead or chalk hidden, maybe under a fingernail, or stuck to a thimble on their finger. While holding the slate under the table, they could quickly scribble a short message backwards, mind you, on the underside.
Writing backwards under a table, that takes some serious practice.
It definitely would. And then the tricky part. How do you make it look like it appeared on the top surface? You have to flip the slate over without anyone noticing. This was often masked by some kind of dramatic action. Maybe the medium pretends to have a neurotic convulsion or claims the spirits jerked violently the slate out of their hands. In that moment of darkness or confusion, quick flip, then they bring it back up.
The drama is misdirection.
Often, yes. And they wouldn't just whip the slate out immediately. They'd often hold it under the table for a bit longer, building the suspense before revealing the message.
Okay, so that covers the flip. But what about the sound of writing? If you're trying to fake a longer message and you're not actually writing it then and there, that's clever. But where did the content of the messages come from? The names, the personal details that made it seem real?
Often very mundane sources. Checking the sitter's coat or hat left in the hallway was apparently common. Letters, business cards, names and hats, they could yield valuable information.
What if the letters were sealed?
The sources mention it was an easy matter to steam a sealed letter open, read it, get the names or details needed, and then reseal it. Good old-fashioned espionage, basically, before the séance even started.
So preparation was key. What about when sitters brought their own slates, maybe marked them, or for really long messages?
That often involved sleight of hand, sometimes Confederates. One classic method was the medium having a trick slate, one with a message already written on it, hidden on their person. During a moment of distraction, maybe when the lights dimmed or just under the table, they'd perform an adroit substitution, swap the sitter's blank slate for the pre-written one.
A quick switcheroo.
Exactly. Henry Slade was apparently known for this. This allowed a Confederate, or maybe the medium using info gathered earlier, to prepare a nice, lucid message beforehand. Sometimes a servant or accomplice might bring in the trick slate while pretending to handle the sitter's slates.
The sources even mention a trick for writing between locked slates. That sounds absolutely impossible.
It does, doesn't it? But again, ingenious physics, not spirits. They describe this trick using a magnet and a tiny iron pellet coated in chalk dust. So it looks like a piece of chalk. You put this pellet between two slates, maybe the sitter even ties them together. Then under the table, the medium holds a strong magnet against the bottom slate.
And the magnet pulls the iron pellet around between the locked slates.
Exactly. The magnet drags the chalk-coated pellet, leaving marks on the inner surfaces. It creates this marvelous effect of writing appearing inside securely fastened slates. Pure mechanics and magnetism.
Wow, the level of detail on these methods is incredible. And the sources mention Evans's own sittings with famous mediums like Slade and Keeler.
Yes, he talks about sittings that genuinely baffled him at first. With Slade, he admits he was unable to penetrate the mystery initially, but later, after learning about conjuring methods, it all became perfectly plain how it was likely done.
And his sitting with Keeler.
That's interesting, too. Evans went in wanting to observe, not challenge aggressively, so he accepted his slates, didn't push for really strict test conditions. He got messages, alleged spirit handwriting.
Which he later realized was probably enabled by his lack of strict control.
Precisely. Looking back, especially after hearing about another investigation into Keeler, he figured out how Keeler could have gotten the names, maybe asking for names on slips of paper beforehand, maybe checking coats in the hall again. There's a specific instance mentioned with Keeler and a Dr. Taylor where a message appeared between tied slates, but Taylor was positive it wasn't his marked slate. It pointed strongly to a substitution, likely done when Keeler pretended to accidentally drop the slates, a classic magician's move, apparently.
So slate writing, despite seeming miraculous, gets systematically taken apart in these sources. It's all skill, misdirection, hidden gadgets. It really offers a timeless lesson, doesn't it? It shows how even simple means, combined with exploiting psychology, can create effects that seem impossible. When you encounter any claim today that seems too good to be true, understanding this history of illusion is so important.
That's a crucial point. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're case studies in critical thinking and the mechanics of deception.
Totally agree.
Ooh.
Okay, moving on from slates, what about materializations? Those hands, faces, even whole bodies appearing out of nowhere. That was another huge, dramatic claim.
Materializations were definitely a cornerstone of physical mediumship, and yeah, the sources are packed with exposures here too. Let's take D.D. Home. He was hugely famous, right? Seances with scientists, royalty. But the sources really focus on the debunked parts of his act.
Like his supposed immunity to fire, handling hot coals.
Yeah, claims like that are explained away with methods known even then. Maybe using spongy platinum with hydrogen for a cooling effect, or applying sulfuric acid as a temporary skin shield, or just cleverly concealed asbestos gloves. Pretty standard stuff for fire eaters, really.
And the glowing spirit hands that floated around.
That was often down to phosphorated olive oil in a bottle. The medium rubs it on their hands, makes them glow eerily in the dark. There's a great anecdote in the sources. Holmes' host at one séance noticed a small bottle Home put on the mantelpiece, quietly pocketed it, and later found it contained this glowing oil. Apparently, the host dropped Home at once after that.
Huh. Caught red-handed. Or maybe glowing-handed. What about Holmes' famous levitations? Did he really float?
The sources are pretty dismissive. They suggest it was likely hypnotic suggestion making people think he floated, or maybe just their imagination running wild in the dark. Or standard stage tricks, like taking off his boots and using a hidden telescopic rod with chalk on the end to mark the ceiling, making it look like a spirit hand did it from up high.
Clever misdirection. And the spirit hands that would reach out from under tables or curtains.
Often explained as a wax dummy hand, maybe on an elastic band, manipulated by the medium's foot hidden under the tablecloth or behind the cabinet curtain. There's even an ingenious improvement described where the medium uses a hollow steel boot toe shape. They put their real foot inside it, then get the sitter to place their foot on top of the steel shape. The sitter thinks they're controlling the medium's foot.
The medium's actual foot is free inside the fake toe, wiggling the dummy hand around.
Exactly. It's fooling the sitter's sense of touch, and spirit music playing on its own. Often just a small musical box strapped to the medium's knee, activated by pressing a hidden button against the table leg. Simple mechanics creating a supernatural effect in the dark.
It really is striking how often darkness, distraction, and simple gadgets are the key, even for someone with Holmes' high society reputation. What about those classic rope-tying escape acts? The Davenport brothers were famous for that, weren't they? Getting tied up in a cabinet and then instruments playing inside.
Oh yeah, The Davenports were masters of the cabinet act, getting tied up seemingly securely by audience members, then instantly producing phenomena that suggested spirits were untying them and playing instruments. But the sources detail exactly how they likely did it.
So how do they get out of the ropes?
Several methods. Part of it was exploiting the volunteers doing the tying. Amateurs often don't tie truly escape-proof knots. The brothers might subtly groan or flinch, making the volunteer instinctively loosen the knot a tiny bit. But more importantly, they had incredible muscle control.
Like Houdini later.
Exactly like that. They could tense their muscles, raise their shoulders, bend their knees just so, flatten their thumbs, creating just enough slack to slip out of bonds that felt tight when they were applied. Physical skill was huge.
Plus knowing how to work the volunteers.
Right. They also reportedly used concealed ropes with pre-tied slip knots. In the darkness of the cabinet, they could quickly swap the genuinely tied ropes for these trick ones.
What about the flower test, where they'd show flour on their hands after playing instruments, proving they were free?
Another trick. Apparently, they dumped the flour they were given into secret pockets, then, just before showing their hands, refill them with flour from hidden little cornucopias or containers. There's a funny story about someone substituting snuff for flour, and the medium still produced flour, kind of giving the game away.
Huh. And did they use accomplices?
Yes. Often a supposed volunteer from the audience was actually a plant, a confederate. They could help with things like swapping coats inside the cabinet or assisting with the mystic tie, a way of twisting the rope to gain slack while the confederates tightened it elsewhere. The sources note that famous stage magicians like Maskelyne and Keller could duplicate the Davenport feats, proving it was achievable by skill. And significantly, William Davenport apparently denounced spiritualism before he died.
Makes it pretty clear their spirit power was just well-honed stage magic. What about other mediums known for escapes, like Annie Eva Fay?
Her specific bandage trick is detailed. It exploited the way sitters held hands and how bandages were put on. She used things like a specific hand clasp behind her back, a hidden bit of knotted cloth as a ligature, maybe a deliberately loose central bandage, and slipping a wrist bandage. All these combined apparently gave her about 20 inches leeway to reach out and manipulate things, even though she looked totally bound. It was a technical escape based on the specific tying method.
And Charles Slade, the Slate writer, he did other physical stuff too.
Yeah, table lifting. The sources say his method involved Confederates under the table wearing vests with concealed steel hinges. When the Confederates stood up slightly, the hinges would catch the underside of the table and lift it. Simple leverage, hidden from view. He also did a spirit necktie trick, cutting the cord around his neck in the dark, using wigs to impersonate ghosts, then swapping in a pre-tied cord before the lights came up. Just basic misdirection and impersonation.
It's amazing how complex some of these deceptions were. Eusapia Palladino is another big name, famous for initially fooling some scientists. What did the sources say about her?
Palladino definitely had a period of success, convincing some scientific commissions, especially in Italy. But the sources focus heavily on her later, very thorough exposure by Dr. Richard Hodgson of the Society for Psychical Research. The SPR Hodgson was known as a really sharp investigator.
And what was Palladino's main technique, according to Hodgson?
Hodgson concluded her key method was incredibly skilled, hand and foot substitution. In the dark or dim light of the séance, she was a master at making one hand and one foot do the work of both. She could, for example, layer her hand on a sitter's hand so skillfully that she could withdraw her own hand without the sitter realizing, freeing it up to cause phenomena while the sitter thought they were still holding both her hands.
Wow, using the sitter's own senses against them.
Exactly. She often worked near a curtain cabinet, using the darkness and the setup to her advantage. Hodgson also suspected she used hidden strings to move objects. She was even seen slapping her own face to simulate spirit clapping while her hands were supposedly occupied elsewhere. Hodgson called her a clever trickster, able to fool even wary observers. The author even adds a personal story about how he once faked a spirit hand in a séance with a medium named Tabor, just by getting his own hand free in the dark. Shows how simple it could be.
It really drives home how much these physical phenomena depended on controlling the conditions, the darkness, the sitter's expectations, the way people were positioned, the lack of proper scientific controls.
That's the unifying theme in all these exposures. The appearance of impossibility was manufactured through carefully managed, though seemingly chaotic, conditions, plus a lot of practiced conjuring skill.
Okay, so Evans and others found overwhelming evidence that most physical phenomena were tricks, that's 7/8. But they did talk about that third possibility, the psychic force. Let's circle back to that.
Right. While direct spirit action was largely debunked for physical effects, this idea of a force coming from the medium was explored for that leftover fraction, things like heavy objects moving without obvious trickery.
And big names like Sir William Crookes investigated this.
Yes. Crookes, the famous physicist, did experiments with D.D. Home using sensitive instruments, like a board suspended on a balance. The sources describe Crookes recording the board's weight changing or the board moving, even when Holmes' hands and feet were held or when he was physically distant from it.
So Crookes saw effects he couldn't immediately explain by Holmes' actions.
That's how it's presented. It suggested to some observers that some kind of force might be emanating from Holmes. But interestingly, the sources also quote Crookes, or perhaps paraphrase him, about the painful state of nervous and bodily prostration Holmes experienced afterwards. This led to the idea that if this psychic force existed, maybe it wasn't some new external force, but more like a drain on vital force or nervous energy from the medium himself.
Like using up your own internal battery to affect the outside world.
Sort of. Sergeant Cox had a similar view, calling it a force from the nerve system. But again, the sources stressed the problems. The power was very uncertain, it fluctuated, it wasn't reproducible on demand.
Which is why mainstream science stayed skeptical. Can't measure it reliably, can't fit it into known laws.
Exactly. So psychic force remains in these sources as this kind of debated, unconfirmed possibility for a few unexplained effects. But it stands in stark contrast to the mountain of evidence for conjuring explaining most physical phenomena.
Okay, so the physical stuff mostly boils down to clever trickery. Let's shift to the subjective phenomena, the trances, the information gathering, the visions. The sources suggest if there's any evidence for something beyond known psychology or fraud, it might lie here. And the main explanation explored is telepathy.
Yes. Telepathy or thought transference gets a lot of attention in these sources. It's defined pretty simply, a communication between mind and mind other than through the known channels of the senses.
And how is this presented? As just an idea or something more solid?
It's presented quite strongly, actually. They lean heavily on the work of the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR. The sources cite investigations by SPR figures like Gurney, Myers, Podmore, suggesting their research provided evidence that telepathy, at least transferring simple ideas or sensations, is an incontrovertible fact. They mention experiments, sometimes using hypnosis, which seem to help, and statistical studies of spontaneous cases like apparitions that seem to show connections beyond chance.
Incontrovertible fact, that's definitely strong language. And Evans himself includes personal stories.
He does. He presents them as striking evidence. There's one about a sitting with a psychic, Miss Maggie Gall. She described a deceased General M using a very specific phrase, and Evans suddenly realized he had been thinking that exact phrase internally just moments before. It suggested to him she'd somehow picked up on his subconscious thought about the general.
Accessing his internal state.
Then there's a really compelling story about a shared dream with his brother. Evan had been working late, reporting on a gruesome train accident where an old man was killed near Mount Washington. The next morning, his brother tells him about this incredibly vivid dream he had. Being on a train to Mount Washington, running down an old man, even describing the specific injuries. Evans points out, you will find the counterpart of that dream in the morning paper, implying the dream mirrored the real event before his brother could have possibly known about it normally.
Wow, that's a striking coincidence, or maybe more.
The most powerful example he gives, though, involves this practical joke. He and a friend L were planning on another friend X, who had a distinctive beard. Evans and L secretly plotted to drug X's coffee, tie him up, and shave his beard off. They swore absolute secrecy.
Sounds like college shenanigans.
Pretty much, but before they could do it, X comes to them, looking disturbed. He tells them about a dream he had the night before, and in the dream he describes coming to L's rooms, having supper, being given a drugged drink, falling asleep, being tied up, and having his beard shaved off. He even dreamt about breaking free and attacking L.
He dreamt the entire secret plan before it happened.
Yes. Evans emphasizes how every particular of the practical joke had been transferred to his mind. He sees this as undeniable proof of the conspiracy, the plan, being telepathically transmitted from his and L's minds to X's mind, probably unconsciously.
Okay, those personal stories, plus the SPR research cited.
Yeah.
You can see why they presented telepathy so strongly. And this connects to ideas about the subconscious mind.
It does. They bring in T.J. Hudson's ideas, arguing that psychics might be tapping into the sitter's subconscious memory, or subliminal consciousness. Evans even speculates further. Maybe facts the sitter never consciously knew, perhaps originating telepathically from a deceased person, could lodge in the sitter's subconscious. Then the psychic accesses that deep hidden information.
That's a really interesting idea. It suggests spirits might still be involved, not by talking through the medium, but by somehow impressing information onto the sitter's subconscious, which the psychic then reads. It also suggests the human mind is way deeper and more capable than we usually think.
Exactly. This idea that the human personality has unknown resources, that it might be a spiritual entity with this significant subliminal layer, is presented as a major implication arising from subjective phenomena, especially when explained via telepathy and the subconscious.
But even if they accepted telepathy as real, its mechanism was still a puzzle for science back then, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The sources quote A.J. Balfour acknowledging this. Telepathy seems directed, right? It goes from one mind to another. It doesn't just spread out everywhere like radio waves, following the inverse square law. Balfour says this does not fit in with anything we know at present in the region, either of physics or of physiology. It raised a huge, important question. How does it work? Oturovich's idea about thought causing physical changes transmitted as undulations is mentioned, but that directedness remained the big sticking point.
Fascinating. Something considered an incontrovertible fact based on observation, yet it fundamentally challenged the scientific models of the time.
It really highlights how scientific understanding evolves. Sometimes explaining one mystery reveals deeper ones.
And it was important, they stress, to distinguish this supposed telepathy from things that might look similar but had known explanations, like muscle reading.
Crucial distinction. The sources are very clear on separating telepathy from muscle reading. They mention performers like Washington Irving Bishop and Stuart Cumberland, who were famous muscle readers. This isn't mind reading. It's a highly refined physical skill.
How does muscle reading work then?
It's all about extreme sensitivity to tiny, involuntary muscle movements. If someone is intensely thinking about, say, a hidden object, their muscles might subtly tense or guide the reader's hand, even unconsciously, when the reader holds their hand or wrist. A skilled muscle reader can pick up on these minute physical cues, these microtremors, especially if the subject is in a state of expectant attention.
So they're literally reading the body's subtle signals, not the thoughts themselves.
Exactly. Charles Gatchell is quoted saying in Muscle Reading, "The ivory is uninfluenced, the human ball obeys," meaning the hidden object isn't doing anything psychic. The person thinking about it is unconsciously providing the physical clues. It's presented as a known physiological thing, heightened physical perception, not paranormal mind link. Making that distinction is vital.
Okay, so for subjective phenomena, telepathy potentially interacting with the subconscious emerges as the leading non-fraudulent explanation in these sources, even with its own scientific puzzles. A big contrast to the trickery explaining most physical stuff. What about seeing ghosts? Apparitions of the dead.
The SPR tackled that too, collecting a massive number of cases, 17,000 reports sifted through. Their main statistical finding, as reported here, was significant. There seemed to be a real connection, not due to chance alone, between a person dying and someone else seeing their apparition, especially around the actual time of death. The odds of it just being coincidence were calculated as extremely low.
So the data suggested something more than chance was linking deaths and sightings.
Yes, and facing that data, the SPR committee proposed telepathic communication between the dying person and the person seeing the apparition as the most likely explanation.
And Evans, based on this, calls it the only rational explanation in these sources.
That's the conclusion presented. He argues these apparitions are subjective hallucinations happening in the mind of the seer, not objective spirits physically present. He raises that classic problem, the clothes. If spirits are non-physical, how do they show up wearing their familiar tweed jacket or Sunday best? A telepathically triggered hallucination neatly avoids this, as the seer's mind constructs the whole image, clothes and all, based on memory or the telepathic impression.
That makes logical sense within that framework. The mind gets the signal, builds the picture.
It does. But the sources are honest, even this telepathic explanation has its tricky spots.
Like what?
Well, it struggles a bit to explain apparitions seen long after death, not just at the moment of crisis. And also cases where the person seeing the ghost had absolutely no idea the other person was dying or even in trouble. If there's no conscious crisis in the sender, how does the telepathic signal get sent?
Right, so telepathy seemed like the best fit for many cases, especially crisis apparitions, but it didn't perfectly explain everything. Some mystery remained.
Exactly. It shows that even as they debunked fraud and found rational explanations like telepathy, the whole picture wasn't completely solved. Some aspects were still puzzling, even to the critical investigators themselves.
Okay, we've covered the physical and subjective phenomena investigated by people like Evans. The sources also spend quite a bit of time on theosophy, especially Madame Blavatsky and her claims.
Yes, theosophy gets significant attention. Founded by Madame Blavatsky, it's discussed as another movement making major occult claims. Its stated aims universal brotherhood, studying Eastern wisdom, investigating hidden natural laws and psychic powers, are noted as seeming laudable enough on the surface.
But the focus quickly shifts to how its reliance on phenomena savored so of charlatanry.
That becomes a central theme. Blavatsky made these extraordinary claims about being guided by hidden Tibetan masters, Mahatmas. These masters supposedly had immense power over nature, could project astral forms of themselves, and communicate intelligently across continents, even dictating parts of her huge books like Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine.
Secret masters providing supernatural help. Sounds familiar.
And the sources state very bluntly, the temple of modern theosophy rests upon the truth of the Mahatma stories. The implication is stark. If those stories are fake, the whole foundation of the movement's authority crumbles.
And the sources then lay out why these claims were considered, quote, exceedingly dubious, citing numerous exposures.
They really do. They detail evidence from multiple angles. First, there were the Kulam's former close associates of Blavatsky in India. They went public with letters allegedly from Blavatsky herself, directing them how to set up fraudulent phenomena, fake materializations, and admitting she wrote letters under the Mahatma name Kuthumi.
Accusations and alleged proof of orchestrated fraud coming from insiders.
Then you have Dr. Richard Hodgson again, the SPR investigator. His report is presented as confirming the fraud. He examined the famous shrine at Edgure, Blavatsky's HQ, where Mahatma letters were supposed to magically appear. Hodgson found it was rigged sliding panels, secret compartments, allowing things to be slipped in secretly.
So the magic mailbox had a back door.
Pretty much. Hodgson also did handwriting analysis and concluded Blavatsky's own writing matched the writing in the supposed Mahatma letters. His final verdict, based on the physical evidence and the handwriting, was deliberate deception.
What other tricks related to these Mahatmic miracles were exposed?
Things like mental questions posed by followers often got vague, non-committal answers supposedly from the Mahatmas. The astral post letters dropping from ceilings was put down to simple conjuring, hidden silk threads or trapdoors. Letters supposedly arriving instantly from afar were explained as elaborate plans using telegraphs and timing to create the illusion of miraculous speed.
Making the mundane look magical.
Yep, and the spirit photography used in theosophy. Exposed as that same magic photography trick we heard about earlier, paper treated with mercuric chloride developing an image when moistened. The same technique used for spirit photos was apparently used for Mahatma photos.
Reusing the same tricks across different types of phenomena.
The sources also bring in Vsevolod Solovatov, a Russian writer who knew Blavatsky. He reported witnessing fraud too. He described catching her using a small silver device to create an astral bell sound she attributed to her master. Even more damning, he claimed he caught her servant, Bavaji, actually writing a Mahatma message in broken Russian.
An eyewitness catching the ghostwriter, so to speak.
And Solovyov claimed Blavatsky later confessed to him that her phenomena were not genuine, and the Mahatma letters were written by herself and others. This alleged confession is described quite dramatically in the sources.
Okay, when you put together the Coulon letters, Hodgson's investigation, Solovyov's testimony, you can see why the sources conclude that basing theosophy on these Mahatmic miracles is exceedingly dubious.
Absolutely. The numerous exposures are presented as fatally undermining the credibility of the movement if it relied on those miracles. The sources even add that actual Tibetan lamas apparently considered Blavatsky's movement rankly heretical and an imposition, denying that real sages could perform such tricks.
The sources touch briefly on who came after Blavatsky, too.
Yeah, it just mentions Catherine Tingley and Annie Besant vying for leadership. Tingley is described rather dismissively, with claims of knowing Blavatsky in ancient Egypt and using unmeaning platitudes.
And the actual theosophical beliefs, aside from the miracles.
Briefly touched on. Doctrines like reincarnation leading eventually to nirvana, which could mean unconsciousness or heightened consciousness, depending. The claim wasn't a new religion, but a revival of ancient wisdom, with Blavatsky as just a messenger. The goal of temples and initiation was supposedly to raise consciousness to connect with one's own divine soul.
So the philosophy is noted, but the emphasis in these sources is definitely on the debunking of the phenomena used to launch and promote the movement.
That's definitely the focus here. The exposures make the foundation seem shaky if built on those miracles.
Okay, so we've journeyed through the investigations of physical phenomena, subjective phenomena, and the specific claims of theosophy, all seen through this critical lens provided by Evans in the sources. Let's try to pull together the main findings, the big takeaways.
I think the clearest conclusion across the board, especially for physical phenomena, is that trickery is king.
That 7/8 figure really sticks. The sources provide this incredibly detailed modus operandi, a playbook for how these illusions were created and how they could be debunked.
Exactly. It hammers home that seemingly impossible physical events were almost always achievable through known means. Sleight of hand, misdirection, hidden devices, muscle control, manipulating the environment, especially using darkness, and playing on expectation.
That potential psychic force remains mostly a question mark.
Yeah, it's discussed for that small remainder of unexplained physical effects, but it's characterized as unreliable, not reproducible, and scientifically suspect because of that. It's not presented as a proven force, more like a placeholder for things not immediately explained by trickery.
But in contrast, telepathy gets treated much more seriously regarding subjective phenomena.
Definitely. It's presented almost as an established fact, incontrovertible, based on the SPR's research and those compelling personal stories. It's offered as the most satisfactory explanation for things like trance communication and many apparition cases, especially those around the time of death.
So the idea is, while the physical world manipulations were largely faked, maybe some genuine, non-sensory communication was happening on a mental level.
That's the strong suggestion. And this leads to that really interesting information about the subliminal consciousness. The idea that these subjective phenomena hint at a deeper layer of the human mind, below everyday awareness.
Which implies the human personality itself might be more complex, maybe even a spiritual entity with unknown resources, capable of things like telepathy operating beneath the surface.
That's the philosophical door it opens, according to these sources. It doesn't prove immortality or anything like that in a scientific sense, but it does suggest the human mind itself is more profound, more mysterious than simple materialism might allow. It challenges purely physical explanations for certain kinds of experience.
Which brings us right back to that tension. Science versus metaphysics.
It really does. The sources show science, through critical investigation like Evans's, being incredibly effective at exposing fraud, superstition, finding rational explanations, but they also acknowledge its limits. Science, as understood then, couldn't definitively prove or disprove things like the soul's immortality. Those big questions remain in the realm of philosophy, belief, beyond empirical proof.
So, stepping back, what's the real educational value for us today in digging into all this historical investigation?
I think the value is huge and still totally relevant. By looking at these old claims and how they were investigated, you get a masterclass in critical thinking. You see how common deception can be, how easily people can be fooled. You learn how psychology, expectation, suggestion, muscle reading, and physiology can create effects that look supernatural. And maybe most intriguingly, you see evidence presented for potentially real but unexplained human abilities like telepathy, offering explanations beyond just spirits or fraud. It suggests the answers might sometimes lie within our own minds.
It's a powerful reminder to always look for the most plausible explanation, demand evidence, and understand how easily our perception of reality can be manipulated, intentionally or not. Those skills are just as vital for navigating the information age as they were in Victorian séance rooms.
It really teaches you to question the how, doesn't it? Not just accepting that something seemingly amazing happened, but asking how it was achieved.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground today, exposing tricks, exploring the edges of the mind. We've seen how rigorous inquiry can dismantle claims of the supernatural.
And yet how that same inquiry, while clearing away the fog of fraud, sometimes seemed to point towards genuine, though perhaps poorly understood, capacities within us.
So let's leave you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on. Given the strong evidence presented in these sources for telepathy as a real human capacity, and this idea of a subliminal consciousness, suggesting we might be spiritual entities with unknown resources capable of mind-to-mind connection below awareness, does this inherent human potential, uncovered by these historical investigators, actually change how we might think about being spiritual? Maybe the real frontier isn't contacting spirits out there, but understanding the full, unexplored potential of the human mind itself, the spirit within. What are those unexplored frontiers these investigations inadvertently hinted at?
It definitely leaves you wondering if the greatest mysteries aren't external, but internal. Perhaps the most profound spiritual discoveries are yet to be made right here within the capabilities of the living human mind.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. Always interesting territory.